Today we're going to talk about something that's very important and very vital to the so-called African American community. And I say the African American community with much disdain because that's what they weren't started off to be like that. Life didn't deal the people called African American these hands that they are dealing with. This is something that their forefathers got them into. And this is something that the African American, the so-called Negro, the so-called Black, the so-called Indian, the so-called American, this is something that they're going to have to deal with and something they're going to have to get out of their own. So what I want to do is just do a little 5-minute meme to talk about a virtue that is seen has been lost in the African American community or to the African American community. And that virtue is integrity. Integrity is one of the virtue that eludes the African American. Of course, there are a few that exhibit this trait, but the numbers are so minuscule, it is almost impossible for that trait to pass throughout the masses. As all life forms on the planet exhibit a connection to one another, the African American exhibits an unwillingness to let the vibes flow through. Instead, they haul it all to themselves and do what they do best, give it away with interest. Hopefully, the few of you that come across this live meme will put into practice what you learn here. You are here for a reason. Haven't you ever wondered what that reason is? The African American is not a being created from nature. I'm going to say that again. And this is why you see it's all mixed up. The African American is not a being created from nature. The African American was trained and taught through machines, TVs, telephones, music, the media. This is what the African American has become. So they are not a being created in nature like their ancestors were. The African American is not a being created from nature. Instead, they were created by those who wish to use them as an artificial entity to build their artificial world, since they themselves are unable to coexist with nature. So this is why the African American changes. He's African American. His mother and father is labeled as black. Their mother and father is labeled as Negro. Their mother and father is labeled as mulatto, and so on and so forth. So the original people of the planet have been Xeroxed off of the planet. The African American is the #1 consumer of items they don't themselves create. The African American doesn't create from nature. As a matter of fact, nature is the one phenomenon the African American doesn't understand and really doesn't care about. Since their move to the cities, the African American has been trained to look on nature with disdain. So remember, you have the cities, Cleveland, Detroit, Indianapolis, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York. Those major cities needed cheap labor. The so-called Negro at the time, and everybody knows this information. Everybody knows that the indigenous people of America are the so-called African American. Though they're the only people who don't know it. The vast majority of them. It is catching on. The African Americans' ancestors were stewards to this part of the earth, which means they were the masters of the natural world. rocks, waters, rivers, trees, resources, foodstuffs, etc. The African American job is to continue to consume anything that they didn't produce until they are genocided off the planet. So the African American, we are told we're the minority all the time. Well, we're not the minority. Simple question. This is where you have to do compare and contrast. What place do you go on the planet where the indigenous people are the minority? The people who are coming in are always the minority. You have just been told, because like I say, you don't look at nature and make your own conclusions about things. You take what other people say and you use them for yourselves. So you're the majority of people. Anybody prove me wrong. Don't give me the numbers that somebody gives you. Give me the numbers of what you had when they got here compared to now. Let's go on that analysis. Let's use a little common sense here. These are the ancestors of the so-called African Americans. Much like ancient Egyptian, the indigenous American civilization is headed down the same path. You see, we like to brag and jump up and down for Egypt. Egypt was colonized and destroyed. Ma'at didn't save them. Osiris didn't save them. Jesus didn't save them. None of that happened. It was obliterated. And their land can't even produce a flower anymore. And when you looked on ancient Egyptian art, you could see the flowers and plants were talking to the people. That's how highly advanced they were. And they failed to nothing. So, is this the path that the African American is going? It looks like it. At the rate the group is going, there have been projections of the demise of the African American. Some of those projections are closer than you think. At the rate the foreigners are entering the country to replace the so-called African American, this phenomenon can no longer be ignored. The conservative estimates have the African America as a non-factor in about 35 years. In many places across America, the reality is more like 15, 10, 20, and yes, as low as 5. There are those that will say, we like baby kids, we don't die, we multiply. To that I say, you better reevaluate your disposition and find yourselves in and come again. The people who go by the moniker African Americans weren't called that 40 years ago. They were called Black. Not that they were Black physically, they were Black spiritually. When they picked up the term and started using it against themselves, it made them incapable of doing anything constructive. Before Black, Negro, Colored, the nations in the English wordplay, Indians, Americans, and the way they spoke of themselves in their language, these are the people of the so-called African American. The African American has been steered away from their ancestors into their current state, and they are being steered off a proverbial cliff. Those of you who understand what is being communicated, keep listening. Those who find this annoying or feel that I just hate my African self, thank you for your time. This is the end of part 1. Part 2 will be coming next week. Thank you for your time.